Moed Katan Daf Vav contains two mishnayos, three disparate sugyas. The beginning of the daf is discussing how you mark graves, and if you see one marker or two markers, what should you assume is included as where there is a grave, where there is tumah there. The Gemara will then go on to discuss the removal of kelayim, forbidden mixtures of planted vegetation from fields, when it was performed and how it was performed. And we'll get to the first Mishnah. The Mishnah will go back to the topic of watering fields, introduce another machlokes about watering, when you can bring water from trees, one tree to another, and water fields. The Gemara will comment on it. And our last Mishnah will discuss briefly hunting, types of rodents which will damage your field, when you're allowed to do that on Chol HaMoed, and when you're allowed to do that during Shemitah. So let's begin. The Gemara is discussing marking graves. As we had seen, you mark a grave, any place where there's tumah, you mark it by painting it with whitish plaster. So Gemara says if you find a stone that's plastered, you should assume that there is tumah underneath the stone and only under the stone. Generally, we make the sign before you reach the tumah in order that you should be able to see it before you step on it, but since the stone is raised, you could assume that it's directly on top of the tumah, and you'll see it from a distance and know to stay away from it. Now, if you have two different stones, so they both have tumah underneath, then the question is, did the sign maker also intend for you to understand that there's tumah between them, and he just marked the edges? So the Gemara says that it should make a difference if it's plowed or if it's not plowed. If the field is plowed up, it is more likely to be tahor. The sign maker didn't bother to create a sign between the two spots if it's unplowed. He said, listen, I'm going to mark the two edges, you'll understand whatever is under it is tameh as well. That is logical. Therefore, if it is unplowed, it could be that it's tameh anyway between the two. If it's plowed, it's more likely that it's not tameh. So the Gemara quotes Rav Yehuda, who says that even though it's not plowed, you have to still, even if the area between the stones is not unplowed, you could still assume that it's tahar between them. I'm going to ask from a brisa that says it's only if it is plowed that you could assume that it is tahar between them. And the Gemara answers there's two different cases of how the markings are made. You seem to have a contradiction that Rav Yehuda said that it's tahar even if it's not plowed, and the brisa says that it's tahar only if it is plowed. So the Gemara says the Brise's case is referring to where there's speckles of sid, speckles of this white cement all around between the two stones. So if it's plowed, then I understand how that white stuff got there. It just got scattered by the plow, and it's a tahar. If however it's not plowed, then you have to assume that the sign maker put those there to indicate that there's tumah between them. Okay, now the Gemara says, what happens if you find the border of a field that's marked with a line of sid? Somebody says if 1, 2, or 3 borders are marked, then you just assume that the tumah is under the markings itself, because you do not assume that he wanted to set off the entire field. Only if it's all 4 sides are tameh, then you'll assume he's trying to show that the entire field is tameh. And the reason is because we don't make markings far from the actual tumah itself. So if you had the entire field was tameh, you could mark off the entire borders. But if not that the entire field is tameh, you wouldn't mark all the borders, because then you'd be making too much space tameh that didn't need to be. Alright, now the Gemara moves on to discuss kelayim. So it's seen in our Mishnah that on Chol HaMoed you're allowed to send the shlichim, the messengers out to go look for kelayim in the fields. That's mixtures of fruit and vegetation or grain that are asur. So the Gemara says, you're telling me that they go out on Chol HaMoed, but it's not true, because you have a Mishnah in Shkalim that says that they go out on the 15th of the month of Adar. The Mishnah describes the order of things that happen in Adar. It says on the 1st of Adar, we announce that people need to be aware that the collection of shkalim is coming up. We also announce that people should watch out for kelayim mixtures. And on the 15th of Adar, we read the Megillah in the walled cities. We go out to clear the thorns from the roads, to clean up the roads, to measure and fix the mikvahs. We do all things that the rabbis require. We also mark graves, and we also go and uproot those kelayim from the fields. Now, Rashi points out that there's many contradictions in this Mishnah to our Mishnah at the beginning of this Masechta, which said that you do all these things on Chol HaMoed. But here it says you do them all on the 15th of Adar. So Rashi explains the other things are not a kasha because you do them twice. They require multiple applications. You have to do them a few times. But pulling out the kilayim, the Gemara, at least at this stage, is asking you should only need to do it once. Once it's gone, it's gone. What do you have to do it for? And the Gemara answers, no, it also has to be done twice. You could have either fruits that bloom early and fruits that bloom late, so you won't see them. So you need to go out early for the early crop and late for the late crop. And another approach is that one is talking about vegetables and one's talking about grain. Grain and vegetables grow at different times. One's early and one's late. And therefore you do have to go twice, once on the 15th of Adar and once on Chal HaMoed Pesach to go check for those things in the field. Okay, says the Gemara, if it bloomed earlier, then you can go pull them out earlier. This is only if it blooms in that season, but if you do see the flowers earlier, then by all means you can go and pull them out early. The Gemara asks, well, why do we send the messengers specifically on Chol HaMoed? Why don't we do a little bit before Pesach, a little after Pesach? Some says, no, we want it to be on Chol HaMoed because there's a lot of workers available. They don't have a lot of work to do. Most people aren't allowed to hire workers on Chol HaMoed. And therefore we can get a good price for the work that we do. So the Gemara points out, this indicates that when the messengers of the Beis Din go to pull out the Kilayim, they're paid by the Beis Din. They are paid by the collection for the Trumas Halishka. If each individual field would pay for, if the owner of the field would pay for the worker that's working on his field, even though he's the messenger of the Beis Din, it's possible that the owner of the field would have to pay for it. If that were the case, then he could hire him to do it whenever he wants. He could make his own arrangement with him when he wants him to work and whatever price he's willing to get. The fact that we are willing to have them be sent to Chol HaMoed so we get a lower price shows that it's paid by the Beis Din, it's paid by the communal collection, and we want to get the cheapest price possible to save community funds. Now, what do you do with it when you find Kilayim? So the Gemara quotes a statement of Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yitzchak, and it's a brisa also. You have to pull it out if the ratio of illegal vegetation to the rest of the field is 1/4 kav per sa. That's a 1:24 ratio. Then you have to pull out enough that the ratio becomes less than that. You thin it out. So Gemara asks, is that true? If you have kilayim, you just thin it out until it's enough of a ratio that it's not a problem. But it's not true. You have a brisa that says that they made a takana, that you have to actually be mafker the entire field. The entire field becomes useless. Gemara says it's not a kasha. That takana happened at some point. This was said before the takana happened. Before the takana happened, they just thinned it out. They pulled out the vegetables that weren't supposed to be there. The Gemara has a brisa that explains the takana. The brisa says that in the beginning, the shlichim of the Beis Din would pull out these vegetables that weren't supposed to be there, and they would throw them in front of the animals of the owner that they could eat them. And that means that the owner of the field is very happy. First of all, his field is weeded for free, and second of all, his animals are fed for free. So they said, okay, we're not going to give it to the animals, we're just going to throw it on the road. But he was still happy because at least he got his field to be weeded for free. So they started saying, okay, from now on we're going to be mafger, we're going to declare useless and ownerless all those fields that have kilayim growing in them for this season. Okay, now we get to our next Mishnah. So the Mishnah discusses making trenches so that water flows from one part of a field to another part of a field. So it's two machlokes between Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov and the Chachamim. Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov says you're allowed to do it in a field of trees, to have the water flow from tree to tree, but you cannot water an entire field like that. And if it is a field of grain, it's got to be a field that started being watered before Yom Tov. If you're just starting now, there's no reason to do it. You're not going to damage the field by pushing off the watering a little bit. If, however, the watering started, so then the general rule is once watering begins, it has to continue at a steady rate. You can't take a break for the entire Chol HaMoed. It'll end up destroying the crops and causing a loss, and therefore it's mutter. Now, the Chachamim argue in both of these halachos, and they say you don't need either of these two conditions. You're allowed to water the entire field, not just from tree to tree, and it doesn't have to be that you started watering it before Yom Tov. You're even allowed to start on Yom Tov, not a problem. Alright, now the Gemara quotes some more halachos. The Gemara quotes Rabbi Yehuda, who says that if it is a field which naturally had moisture, it's a naturally moist field, and then it dried out, then you're allowed to water it as well. That counts as a field that was already started being watered. Quotes the brisa that says that the brisa says when you're not allowed to water a field, we're referring to a field that wasn't watered before Yom Tov. If it was watered before Yom Tov, you are allowed to. All the same thing is true if it's a soggy field that dried out. The only thing you're not allowed to water is a dry field. A field that was always dry and was never watered. Now the Brisa says though that the Chachamim disagree with that, as we see in our Mishnah. The Chachamim say no, you're allowed to begin watering a field. It's not a problem. All these cases you're allowed to water them. They didn't hold of any of these isurim. Says the Gemara. Ravina says according to the Chachamim you should be allowed to sprinkle water on your garden. If you had a vegetable garden that wasn't watered yet and it needs to be sprinkled, you're allowed to. Because the point of watering a dry field for the beginning is not to avoid the damage. It's so that crops bloom earlier and they bloom healthier. Well, that's also the point of sprinkling water on a garden so that the crops bloom earlier and they bloom healthier. And therefore, if you're allowed to do that, according to Chachamim, you're allowed to do it here also in the garden as well. Now I'm going to quote a Brisa. It says you're allowed to sprinkle water on a wheat field, on a grain field, during Shemitah, but not on Chal HaMoed. You're not allowed to do that then. So Gemara asks, well, have a Brisa that says you are allowed to. You are allowed to do it on Chol HaMoed, not only on Shemitah. So Gemara says not a kasha. Once a Blaz Ben Yaakov, once a Chachamim. Like we've seen that they have a machlokas about that. Now Gemara has another Brisa. This Brisa says you're allowed to sprinkle water on a field before Shemitah and on Shemitah. You're allowed to sprinkle it before Shemitah in order that the crops should grow on Shemitah. You're allowed to sprinkle on Shemitah in order that the crops should grow after Shemitah. You're not allowed to sprinkle water during Shemitah for crops to grow during Shemitah. That you're not allowed to do. And now we get to our second Mishnah. This Mishnah discusses hunting down rodents that are causing destruction to your field. So Mishnah says you're allowed to hunt an ishus. The Gemara explains an ishus is a blind rodent that eats crops. The Gemara says you can learn that name from the pasuk in Tehillim that says Kemo Shablul Temes Yahaloch Nefel Eshes Bal Chazu Shemesh, like a snail or snail shell that gives off moisture as it walks. So is the Eshes Bal Chazu Shemesh, the Eshes which doesn't see the light. So Eshes is this Ishus, is like a mole. The Gemara says it has no eyes and it doesn't see, but it does destroy your crops. But anyway, so an ishus and a mouse can be hunted from your field. So the Gemara had the Brisa says a few halachos here. The Brisa says you're allowed to hunt it from a field of trees, and from a field of grain in a normal way, in the normal way that you hunt it, both on Chal HaMoed and on Shemitah. The Chachamim say if it's a grain field, you have to do it in a not normal way. It doesn't cause so much destruction to grain, only to fields of trees, and therefore you should do a shinui of some sort. You shouldn't hunt it in a normal way that you do. Now, what if you would like to build up the wall of your field? So here, the Mishnah says that on Shemitah you can build a wall from scratch. You could fix a broken wall, not a problem. Even though it looks like you're protecting your fruit, that's not a problem. On Chal HaMoed, though, you can only fix a broken wall. You cannot build a new wall from scratch. Okay, the Gemara begins here. The Gemara identifies the Ishus like we said before. Then the Gemara brings a Brisa. The Brisa says you're allowed to hunt the Ishus and mice from a field of grain and from a field of trees in the normal way. And then it says you're also allowed to destroy ant holes. How do you destroy ant holes? So Rav Shimon ben Gamliel says you take a little soil from a different ant hole from somewhere else and you put it in here. And then what happens is they choke each other. Because they smell soil they're not familiar with, they get confused, they're not sure what's going on, and they end up attacking each other, and the entire ant colony will be destroyed. So Gemara says, though, it has to be soil that you're sure that they're not familiar with. So it either has to be on the other side of a river that has no bridge, or plank bridge, or rope bridge, any type of connection at all from one end to the other, so that the ants could cross. Or it could be a parsa away, even on the same side of the river. Then you know that the ant didn't travel a parsa, so they were not familiar with the soil there, and they'll destroy each other.